Hello again, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us for this Monday's edition of Alaska Weather, 10th day of October 2022. Up first, hazardous weather graphic, say flood watch out for the eastern North Gulf Coast, the Yakutat area, and the northern Panhandle. That goes into effect Wednesday afternoon. South to north moving storm coming up toward the eastern North Gulf Coast, the low center, and associated front will have a big fetch of moisture from the south. And look for moderate to heavy rains developing in the afternoon Wednesday there for the watch area. And the additional rainfall could result in flooding, maybe, just a watch at this point. But that goes into effect Wednesday evening, continues through Thursday. Otherwise, up to the north there, western and central Arctic coast, there's a winter weather advisory out for Tuesday and Tuesday night. And that's for snow and winds out of the west or southwest gusting to 50 miles per hour. Onto satellite imagery. And you can see a system there tracking eastward from Bristol Bay. Now the center roughly over the Barren Islands, give or take there, with the moisture band really not producing a lot of precipitation up over the North Gulf Coast or into interior Alaska today. And moisture pushing off to the east, just grazing the eastern North Gulf Coast, and about to move into the bulk of the moisture still to the west of the northern Panhandle there. That'll be moving in tonight, but the front will be weakening. A lot of cloud cover up over interior Alaska all the way to the Arctic coast, and you can see the clouds moving from pretty much west to east, and some snow showers arriving on the coast of the western Arctic coast. Not much going on out over the Bering Sea, just some areas of clouds there. Weak system there north of the western Aleutians, but really not much action there. And rolling this again, you can see not much in the way of any clearing going on other than British Columbia there. A lot of cloudy skies, maybe some sun breaks there over the portions of the Aleutians today in the Fox Islands. To go along with those gusty northwest winds they had, actually strong winds, gusted peak wind gust at False Pass of 69 miles per hour earlier today, and up to 68 miles per hour at Cold Bay out of the northwest, while Nelson Lagoon had a wind gust of 66 miles per hour. And on Alaska, Dutch Harbor area, had a wind gust of 60 miles an hour. Winds coming down this afternoon, especially over the eastern Aleutians, and Pribilof's really lightening up there with the ridge ahead of that trough farther to the west. They're only bringing some areas of light rain there to a narrow band there, just approaching Adak this afternoon. Otherwise, a tighter gradient producing wind gusts of 40 to 50 miles an hour over the Alaska Peninsula, with some rain and snow showers in that area. Otherwise, pretty light precipitation amounts. Sitka has only picked up 1/100 of an inch in the last 12 hours, while same amount at Yakutat. Cordova, only 5/100 of an inch. A little bit heavier rainfall that low as it passed over Bristol Bay. Togiak had 1/3 of an inch before the rain ended earlier today, and Dillingham to King Salmon area picked up about 1 to 2/10 of an inch. Up to the north, a little bit of snow fell, areas of light snow. Kotzebue may have picked up about 1/2 an inch, and some light snow also on the western Arctic coast, some scattered snow showers on the east side with a couple of weak troughs there. And for the forecast for tonight, that front will weaken as it pushes into the eastern North Gulf Coast, approaches the northern Panhandle. The southern portion will really weaken. Just some showers in over the Prince of Wales Island area, Ketchikan, Metlakatla, into Misty Fjords area. A little bit more continuous light rain, periods of, for the northern Panhandle. And in the Coast Range, rain or snow, depending on the elevation. And just maybe some light snow, northern Copper River Basin, eastern Alaska Range. Could spill into the upper Tanana Valley, but those amounts will be quite light. Look for some flurries into Kotzebue Sound, and areas of light snow for the northwest coast. and that trough spreading more snow into the western Arctic coast. Winds should kick up anywhere from 20 to 30 miles per hour, maybe gust 35 miles an hour in the exposed areas up there. Then a little bit stronger one will approach the coast tomorrow, and that could kick the winds up to 50 miles an hour. Otherwise, for tomorrow, looking at Tuesday, high pressure in over Bristol Bay, much of the Bering Sea, southern Bering Sea, see light winds with some clearing, dry conditions. Even the northern Bering Sea looking pretty good with light winds into the Seward Peninsula, St. Lawrence Island. Look for a fair amount of sunshine, Kodiak Island, the Alaska Peninsula, and should be some good clearing also, Cook Inlet and the Kenai Peninsula up into the Susitna Valley. And dry conditions over the central part of the state all the way to the eastern Arctic coast, just some scattered showers there. Eastern Norton Sound, snow showers in the western Brooks Range, and increasing wind and precipitation for the western Arctic coast, especially into the afternoon. Scattered showers to isolated showers, southern Panhandle, and then shower activity a little more widespread over the northern southeast coast, eastern North Gulf Coast areas. And then down to the south, you can see that warm front. That's the next system. It'll be pulling northward. And then out to the west, that next front will be taking a push to the east, and that's going to put the squeeze on that high pressure area over Bristol Bay and kind of lock it in over the eastern Bering Sea and along the west coast with another center up over the north central interior. So pretty dry conditions south of the Brooks Range and north and west of the Alaska Range with some pretty good clearing, kind of a dry, cool pattern all the way down to Bristol Bay and the Alaska Peninsula. Look for gale force winds and rain to push into the central Aleutians ahead of that front, and gusty winds there on the south side of that low center over the western Aleutians. And also gale force winds coming up to the eastern North Gulf Coast along the north coast of the Panhandle with that system, along with that fetch of moisture from south to north. Pretty good plume of rainfall with increasing to moderate to heavy at times. So the eastern North Gulf Coast and eventually into the Panhandle. That'll probably be Wednesday evening or night. Lighter amounts down to the south, maybe call it just a chance of rain through Wednesday afternoon for the southern Panhandle. Otherwise, looking pretty good. Still windy, but not quite as windy on the western Arctic coast. But still pretty good winds, probably gusting anywhere from 25 to 35 miles an hour with periods of snow, mostly along the Arctic coast, western north slope. Some of that could slip on down into the northwest coast, possibly in the Noaa Valley, but those amounts will be quite light. Looking at low temperatures for tonight, in the 40s, some cases upper 40s for the Panhandle, mid-20s in the Copper River Basin, 25 to 30 for the Manuska Susitna Valley, Cook Inlet, Kenai Peninsula, upper 30s around Homer and Seldovia, lower 20s for the Kuskokwim Valley, upper 20s there in Bristol Bay, mid-30s, Kodiak Island. Highs for tomorrow, 55 to 60, southern Panhandle, otherwise northern areas mostly in the mid-50s, near 50 for the North Gulf Coast, mid-40s Kodiak Island, upper 30s in the Susitna Valley, mid-30s Copper River Basin, 35 to 40 in the Kuskokwim Valley, lower 40s for Bristol Bay, and 40 to 45 for the Kenai Peninsula. Followed by lows a little chillier in the Copper River Basin down to in the mid-teens there, or 10 to 15, mid-20s Susitna Valley, mid to upper 20s, south central Alaska, and for the Panhandle, lows in the 40s once again, mid to upper 20s for Bristol Bay, and teens in some areas of the Kuskokwim Valley. Followed by highs pushing 60 degrees again around Prince of Wales Island, otherwise mid-50s over the northern Panhandle. Highs mostly in the lower 30s for the Copper River Basin, mid-30s Kuskokwim Valley, near 40 Bristol Bay, mid-40s Kodiak Island, and upper 30s to lower 40s south central Alaska. Up to the north, lows in the single numbers for the Brooks Range tonight, Arctic Village to Anatuvik Pass, Galbraith Lake areas, mid-20s, central Arctic coast, otherwise 20 to 25 in the central interior to near freezing around St. Lawrence Island. Highs tomorrow near the frost point along the central Arctic coast, but 20s on the east side there, and upper teens to lower 20s in the Brooks Range, and upper 20s to mid-30s south of the Brooks Range. Wednesday morning, lows 0 to 10 in the Brooks Range, the Arctic Valley, or Arctic Village down around 0, otherwise in the 20s elsewhere, followed by highs in the teens there in the Brooks Range, 20s and 30s everywhere else. Out to the southwest, lows tonight in the 30s, except the Aleutians near 40, and then the highs tomorrow, mid to upper 40s central Aleutians, Alaska Peninsula, Pribilofs, mid-30s St. Lawrence Island. Lows mostly in the 30s to near 40, followed by highs in the 40s to lower 50s around Adak.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Tuesday morning flying weather graphic. Some IFR up over the northeast interior and some VFR for the central and eastern North Slope Arctic coast. And also VFR northern Bering Sea, St. Lawrence Island, Seward Peninsula, Norton Sound, much of the southwest interior. A little bit of marginal VFR along the southwest coast. Back to the Pribilofs, down to AKwx, eastern Aleutians. IFR eastern North Gulf Coast, northward there to just south of Eagle. IFR over most of the Panhandle. And then for the afternoon, we've got some improvement, especially over south central Alaska, all becoming VFR there. Some lingering marginal VFR along the Alaska Range, western Alaska Range, and up into the Tanana Valley, also along and south of the Brooks Range. Some IFR central western Arctic coast down to about Point Hope. Marginal VFR for the northwest coast, Noaa Valley, into the Selawik Valley, Kotzebue Sound, northern Seward Peninsula. Swath of VFR, St. Lawrence Island, right on down to the Pribilofs, Adak and Atka. And marginal VFR for the eastern Aleutians into Bristol Bay and the southwest coast. Marginal VFR for the Panhandle, eastern North Gulf Coast. And for Wednesday morning, still some IFR there over the eastern Copper River Basin down to Yakutat and Lynn Canal Glacier Bay IFR, Prince of Wales Island IFR, VFR Kodiak Island, south central Alaska, including Prince William Sound and the western Copper River Basin, northward up to about Nanana, and much of the southwest interior, all the way out to the Pribilof Islands, eastern Aleutians VFR, building IFR out over the western Aleutians and Bering Sea. Marginal VFR there along much of the Yukon River, and then up along the Brooks Range to the eastern Arctic coast. And for the afternoon Wednesday, IFR for the central and western Arctic coast there with same thing for the North Slope. Marginal VFR, most of the interior there, especially north and west of the Alaska Range. Bristol Bay VFR, Cook Inlet, Manuscus, the Sitna Valley VFR. Marginal VFR now into western Prince William Sound with IFR over the Copper River Basin. North Gulf Coast to Yakutat, marginal for the Panhandle. VFR, Kodiak Island, a band of IFR there, pushing eastward to Adak and Hamchitka. Marginal VFR for Anatuvik and Adigan passes tomorrow. Lake Clark and Merrill, same thing, marginal VFR. And marginal VFR to maybe some VFR at times for rainy Tuesday. Windy, starting out marginal, becoming VFR. Better chances in the afternoon for VFR flying there. And Isabel, kind of a off and on marginal VFR day Tuesday. Mentesta, same thing. Tanita, though, VFR. Portage looking good. VFR flying through the pass there as well. Chilkoot and White, marginal. And for the freezing levels at the surface, down into the southwest interior and across the northern Susitna Valley there to around Northway and Tok, freezing level. And then 2,000 feet, 2 to 8,000 feet across the Panhandle, 2,000 across Kodiak Island, and 2,000 out over the southern Bering Sea. Icing, some mixed or rime icing of the light variety, southeast interior into the northern Panhandle as well as the western Arctic coast, and then heavier icing starting to build out to the west there with that next system, mostly over the Komodorsky Islands. And for the jet stream, got a sharp trough tomorrow morning or tomorrow afternoon along the west coast there with southwest winds 165 to 170 knots across southern Alaska, northerlies 135 across the Aleutians. And looking at 9,000 feet, weak low up over southern Alaska there, west-northwest 35 knots down across the Barren Islands, and then southwest up to 40 knots cutting across Yakutat and into the Panhandle. Could be up to 50 knots there across the southern southeast coast, and then increasing winds out over the far western Aleutians. And for 3,000 feet, we've got westerlies at 35 knots along the western Arctic coast there over toward Prudhoe Bay, Dead Horse area. Much lighter across interior Alaska, and still some good northwest winds at 35 knots from Kamishak Bay across the Barren Islands, and also cutting across southwest Kodiak Island. Otherwise, pretty light and variable. Most areas around the state, including the Panhandle and the interior. And then 65 knot winds there toward the Komodorskis, gradually edging eastward toward Shimi and Attu late. Look for increasing moderate chop there for the western Aleutians late in the day Tuesday. Moderate chop also for the western Arctic coast, with light to isolated moderate chop, southern Cook Inlet, Barren Islands, and Kodiak Island as well.
Hello again, I'm meteorologist Dave Snyder with the National Weather Service for another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. And joining us again, talking about the Augmented Reality Sandbox, is Eric Stevens from GINA, the Geographic Information Network of Alaska. And he's actually talking about a project from AKwx, which is the experimental program to stimulate competitive research. A lot of acronyms, but some really fun stuff today, right, Eric?
You bet. We've got a learning tool that is a tool that's fun to use, and it really has a relevance to actually daily lives of anyone who goes outside and sees lumpy topography in Alaska. We've got a lot of mountains and such. You know, when I was younger and go on your first hike in the hills, say, you're given, maybe you're in the Boy Scouts or you get at the kiosk at the trailhead, a topographic map, a flat piece of paper with all these lines on it, bullseyes, long lines that curve back on themselves, say, perhaps things that look like this, a quadrangle or a topographic map. We've got here just to illustrate a couple of examples near Denali. Alaska has so much topography, so many mountains. And what are all these lines that we see? It can be tough to know what this means the first time you look at it. What we've got, all these lines represent lines of where the elevation of the topography goes through a certain level above sea level, say that this line represents where the mountains have gone from below 1,000 feet, mean sea level, up through 1,000 feet and above. That's your 1,000-foot contour. And when the mountain keeps going up, you're up to 1,200 feet, 1,400 feet, and so on. And that's how you get this little bullseye around the peak of a mountain.
Kind of makes layered slices, right?
Kind of like layered slices. Nice way to look at that. And when you see the lines are closer together, you're going up more steeply. If the mountain rises more slowly, it takes you longer in horizontal space to go through those different vertical increments.
So that is really hard to visualize.
Right. Imagine you're looking at a 2D piece of paper, two-dimensional piece of paper, but you're trying to understand what the three-dimensional world looks like. Well, enter the augmented reality sandbox. Yes, what is that? It is right here. We have the sandbox with us today, Sandbox 2.0, portable version. Built up at University of Alaska Fairbanks. And we've got a couple of folks helping out today.
Let's see, Alana Valaji, and she's a mechanical engineering student from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. If you want to give us a thumbs up there, Alana, thanks for helping us out today. And Courtney Breest, she's the outreach coordinator from AKwx, also helping us out today. Thanks, Courtney. And
this tool here has a Microsoft Kinect to sense the level of sand in this sandbox. And then the Kinect feeds its information into a computer that then sends a signal to a projector to draw the appropriate topographic lines on this topography. The fun thing about this, as we can see here, is that the sandbox and its Kinect and its projector, they all work as a team. So here we've got a mountain in the middle of the sandbox. What if we took down the mountain to some degree? Watch as the software responds and redraws the topography.
Kind of a caldera forming there.
There you go, And what's fun about the sandbox too is it knows that gravity flows downhill, and we've got some water that's actually down in the lowest elevations. And what's happening now is we're making it rain a little bit. We'll fill up rain into that elevated lake bed, that caldera, as you said. And so now water is pooled up there. And what if you gouged out an outlet channel?
Glacial dam release.
There you go. The water flows out. What we're seeing here is a tool that allows people to touch and connect, Microsoft Connect, RRR, to connect two-dimensional topographic maps like what we have here, these flat things on a piece of paper, to the real three-dimensional world. I think this Sandbox's real particular application as a learning tool to young people is, what does a two-dimensional map mean when it's trying to represent the three-dimensional world? This sandbox is kind of both at once. It's actually three-dimensional, lumpy topography there, the sand, but it's got these lines drawn on the three-dimensional sand that would be on a two-dimensional piece of paper.
Wow, that is a huge leap from the learning that we experienced when we were younger to how children and even adults are visualizing in these new forms of technology. Allows that to kind of reshape their thinking and visualize this in a very useful and absolutely hands-on way. It's amazing.
It's a hands-on tool. And
it's hard for me to sit here and not go play with that.
well, that's what happened at GINA, up at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks, when the first model was being made, the prototype with plywood and such. We had professional adult professor types had heard about this, and they came by because they wanted to see how it worked.
Okay.
And everyone becomes that idealistic, wonder-filled youngster.
Sure.
And you just can't help but play with that and to see how it reacts in time, and
right.
It's a dynamic learning tool, and it
Dynamic,
responds.
That's exactly the word.
And you wonder what applicabilities beyond a teaching tool for
Where does it
topography
go?
can it have? You can see how in Alaska we have inundation mapping is an issue. If you had water slosh inland, say in a coastal flooding event on the western coast of Alaska or the Arctic coast, you could see this. The concept is illustrated here as an introductory learning method. I think this is a potentially good outreach tool for all of us in Alaska.
Okay, so not only just a topographical sense, a mapping sense, maybe something that leads into understanding of how geographic information systems work with GIS, but also geology, if we wanted to get into kind of the formations and the bigger land masses and the representation of the 2D map. We could go into hydrology, which is very important in Alaska, of course. And even just understanding the weather sense. Mounding up a big pile of sand could be that Arctic high pressure system sitting on top of Fairbanks, and the voids would be low pressure systems. This can go a lot of different directions.
Yes, exactly. It's not just landforms, but pressure has contours of high pressure and low pressure. And I wish I had this kind of a learning tool when I was taking Meteorology 101 back 25 years ago.
Wow.
Would have been helpful, I think.
Probably would have gotten a better grade, yeah. Okay, thank you so much for coming by, Eric, and Alana and Courtney, thank you so much for your help there in the sandbox. We are going to play in the sandbox a little bit more coming up tomorrow on our next edition of Alaska Weather Facts. We hope you join us for that. In the meantime, make sure you go to alaska.edu/EPSCOR. That's alaska.edu EPSCOR to learn more information about what we're doing with this augmented reality sandbox around Alaska. We'll see you next time on Alaska Weather Facts.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
On to marine forecasts for the south coast of the Panhandle on Tuesday. West winds 20 to 25 knots. For the north coast, west winds 20 knots, seas as high as 13 feet. And for Clarence Strait, south winds at 15 knots. Otherwise, for the central northern interchannel, small craft advisories, south winds 25 knots with 5-foot seas. And moving on to Wednesday, gale warnings for the central and south coast of the Panhandle, winds increasing from the south up to 35 knots. And small craft advisories for the north coast, south to southeast winds 25 to 30 knots. And for Stevens Passage and Clarence Strait, southeast winds Wednesday at 25 knots, south 25 for Lynn Canal. Prince William Sound for Tuesday, northwest winds 25 knots, seas 5 feet, and west winds 25 knots for the eastern North Gulf Coast. Northwest winds 30 knots for the western North Gulf Coast, and gale warnings for the Barren Islands, northwest winds 35 knots. Gale warnings also out for Kamishak Bay, west winds sustained at 40 knots. And small craft advisories for southern Cook Inlet for northwest winds at 25 knots. North of the Forelands, lighter winds out of the northwest at 15. And for Wednesday, Cook Inlet, north winds 20 to 25 knots with 4 to 6 foot seas. Prince William Sound, small craft advisories, north winds 25 knots. And for the North Gulf Coast, north to northeast winds at 30 knots. Gale warnings for the Barren Islands. Winds will be out of the northwest at 40 knots. Kamishak Bay, north winds at 30 knots. Kodiak Island for Tuesday, northwest winds 25 to 30 knots. For the Alaska Peninsula, west-northwest wind at 15 knots. And Bristol Bay looking at northwest winds at 15 knots. And then for Wednesday, north winds 15 knots for Bristol Bay, Kodiak Island, northwest 25 to 35 knots with seas as high as 12 feet. And for the Pacific side of the Alaska Peninsula, northwest winds 25 knots. Bering Sea side, winds will be northeast at 15 knots. For the western Aleutians, Kiska to Shemya for Tuesday, south winds 30 knots. Otherwise, the central Aleutians, northwest winds 20 knots, seas around 8 feet. And for the eastern Aleutians, west to southwest winds at 15 to 20 knots with 6 to 7 foot seas. And for Wednesday, for Unimak Island, gale warnings, south to southeast winds increasing to 40 knots. On Alaska Island, winds will be southwest to east at 30 knots. And gale warnings for the central Aleutians, south winds 35 to 40 knots. Southwest 40-knot winds in the forecast for Amchitka Island, Kiska to Shimia, winds southwest at 30 knots. For the west coast, or southwest coast, on Tuesday, west winds 15 to 20 knots. Pribilofs, variable winds at 15 knots. St. Matthew and St. Lawrence Island will be looking at west winds at 15 knots with 5 to 6 foot seas. And Norton Sound, west winds 20 knots, seas 4 feet. And moving ahead to Wednesday, for Norton Sound, winds will be lighter out of the west at 10 knots with 3 foot seas. St. Lawrence Island looking at west winds at 10 knots, seas 4 feet. Yukon Delta Coast, light variable winds at 10 knots, seas around 4 feet. And for the Kuskokwim Delta Coast, winds will be north at 10 knots with 4 foot seas. But out to the west, winds coming up to small craft advisory levels for the Pribilofs there. Southeast increasing to 25 knots, seas building to 6 feet. And for St. Matthew Island, winds will be southeast, increasing to 30 knots during the afternoon hours with seas building to 10 feet. And then up to the north, for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast, southwest winds 20 to 25 knots. Central coast, southwest at 25 knots. Gale warnings for the western Arctic coast, southward there to Cape Thompson. West winds 35 knots, 10 to 11 foot seas. And for Wednesday, small craft advisories for all of the Arctic coast. Winds will be out of the west at 25 to 30 knots. For the eastern Beaufort Sea coast, southwest at 30 knots. And for tonight, look for some gusty winds with areas of snow coming into the western Arctic coast with the next trough. Some flurries as far south as Kotzebue Sound, maybe to Selawik. Otherwise, most of interior Alaska pretty dry. Lingering snow showers or rain and snow showers from the Manuska Valley eastward and the North Gulf Coast area. Some rain over the northern Panhandle and showers to the south. And then for Tuesday, not bad over the interior. There's a winter weather advisory out Tuesday and Tuesday night for the western Arctic coast for west winds gusting to 50 miles per hour with snow. Otherwise, mostly dry over interior Alaska. Next front pushes gale force winds and rain into the central Aleutians Wednesday afternoon. Rain heavy at times developing over the North Gulf Coast.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.